Hello everyone, and it's time to make your solar system maps. So, how is it that you are going to make the most fantastic solar system map possible in the whole history of all solar system maps? Well, just pay really close attention to this video. If you need to, you can even rewind it and watch it a couple times. But it really comes down to three big things, right? There's the spacing of the planets and all the things in the solar system. How far apart are they? There's the shape of things, usually round, but not always. But for the planets especially, they should be pretty round, not looking kind of like big potatoes or ovals or things like that. And then thirdly, the coloring and the details. It shouldn't look like you kind of like scribbled it together, on the way into school that day when it's going to be due. It should look, like you spent a little bit of time working on these to make them look fairly nice and everything. So as far as sizes go, now this is not the correct spacing. This would lose points for you on spacing. But sizing, I mean, some of the planets are fairly tiny. Two of the planets in the middle are fairly large. And then there are kind of two medium-sized planets. And I mean, poor little Pluto would be out here, not really counting as a planet anymore. It's itsy-bitsy for us. Now, the sheet that you're going to need is the yellow sheet that I handed out in class, or whatever color it happens to be that year. But this yellow sheet, or this sheet, it's going to tell you all the information that you desperately need in order to get all the points possible. That is the rubric, and your rubric should be handed in with the project, right, to get all the points. In fact, I usually don't even accept it unless this is attached to it, whether it's stapled or taped or glued, I guess. Some way it's got to be attached on there so that you can get the points, because this is what I'm marking so that you can see where you lost points on your project if you do lose any points. But for each one of the things, right, there's the sun, there are all the planets, there's the asteroid belt, and Pluto is part of an asteroid belt. All of that stuff is right here. So for each one of the things, it tells you how to make them, right? For the sun, I mean, it's really big, so big you can't fit the whole thing on the entire sheet. Let's say Mercury, for example, the first planet. I mean, it tells you how far away it is from the planet, and that's going to be the outer edge, or the closest part of the planet to the sun is only going to be on our scale 1.4 centimeters away, right? Then it also tells you the other big number is how big around the object is. In Mercury, it's going to be 1 centimeter. So you're going to need, a meter stick, right? Make sure you are not using the evil centimeter side, because, well, that's going to throw all the scale off for you and everything. You need to use the metric side. Now, what do you do if you don't have a metric ruler at home? Because if you're doing this at home, well, you need to do some kind of conversion, right? If you just have inches and you don't have the metric system and everything, then you'll have to convert it. So the easiest way, you could look it up online, or you could use technology. Just ask your phone, say, how many centimeters? Let's say if you're doing Venus here, what you just say. 2.8 centimeters is how many inches, right? And it'll do that little conversion for you. But you need to make sure that it's in the same distance that it would be if you're using the metric system when you're doing this, right? So that tells you, size of, distance from the planet to the sun, tells you how big around it is, tells you, most of the planets are all going to be shaped like a sphere. The asteroid belt, that's going to be all kinds of weird, crazy shapes that you can kind of make up. And it even tells you some of the basic colors, right? So you can kind of get an idea of that. But I would have you look them up when you're doing that. So let's say you want to do Earth, right? The most important of all the planets. For Earth, here's the little portion of the sheet that you need, right? So let's say you're doing Earth. It tells you it's 4 centimeters away from the surface of the sun, right? So you kind of like line up the end of your ruler. It's 4 centimeters away. Sorry, it's kind of like a forced perspective in the picture right here. But this picture, Earth is 4 centimeters away. Earth is 2.6 centimeters in distance, right? And so it kind of starts over here, but it's 1, 2, and then that would be 6.6 centimeters around is the planet. And it should be reasonably shaped around, when you're doing Earth. When you go to color them, it should look like Earth. It shouldn't just be a little blue scribble and a little green blob here or there. That's going to lose you points. It should actually look like, okay, there's Florida, or, if you're doing, whatever side, there's Europe or Africa, or whatever it is that you're doing for it. It should actually look like a picture of Earth when you're actually drawing these for it, right? So that's the way that you measure each one of the planets from it. To put the project together, you've got, hold on here, your really big piece of paper. You're going to cut that piece of paper in half, kind of like in the picture right here. Tape it together in the middle, right? I highly recommend put where it says My Solar System, put that on the far right-hand side. That way it's kind of out of the way. You don't want it over here where the sun is because it kind of seems to get in the way of the sun, and then where some of the larger planets are, it gets in the way. So put where it says My Solar System way out on the far right-hand side where Pluto's going to be. Then when you go to make the sun, right, the sun, it's not a straight line for the scale that we have, but it's kind of almost close to it. You just want to have a slight curve to it. Now, how far in you put the sun, like how big is it? You can't show the whole sun. Our map is just not nearly big enough for that. So I usually tell people just kind of make it like a gentle curve. You just have to keep one thing in mind, right? Pluto, right, is going to be 158 centimeters away from the sun. So dwarf planet Pluto, from wherever the edge of your sun is, this is 1 whole meter stick right here, and this is about 58 centimeters there, so 158 centimeters. You just want to be careful. If you make your sun too big, 158 centimeters ends up off the paper and everything, and then if you make that mistake, just sometimes people tape like an extra piece of paper onto the end, but it doesn't have to be really thin, but a couple centimeters thick for your sun will help you out so that you don't run out of room that way. Okay, then the trouble that some people have is, okay, how far do I make the surface of the planet from the distance-wise away from the sun? So from wherever the edge of the sun is, you're just going to measure. In the case of Jupiter, it's 20.8 centimeters away. If you look at that sheet again, that's right here. It's 20.8 centimeters away. So you just measure from the center of the sun, or the edge of the sun, to 20.8 centimeters away. That's going to be the edge of, in this case, Jupiter right here. Now you want to make Jupiter round, right? And it tells you, again on this yellow sheet, Jupiter is 28.4 centimeters wide, right? So wide. So that means if you kind of divide it in half, is the way for the bigger planets that people have found is the easiest. If you just divide whatever the number is in half, in this case it would be only 14.2. If you just measure from that point where you want to start the planet, 14.2, that's going to be the center of the planet, right? And then all you have to do is just keep measuring 14.2 around and around and around, kind of like this, 14.2, 14.2, 14.2, 14.2. And you get like these little check marks is the way that you kind of do that. And then all you got to do is kind of connect the dots, and then that way you get a nice round planet, right? So for the larger planets, that's the method that students have found that kind of seems to work for them as far as getting it, where, how distance-wise from the sun just right, getting it size-wise, scale all the way around just right, and making it, a nice, smooth, round shape for it, right? So that's kind of like, here you go. Here's one that I actually made a long time ago. It kind of gives it a, at least a reasonably round shape is what you should have for it. Once you've got all the planets in there, I highly recommend, right? First step is put the sun in there. Then just draw the diameters of all the planets, and they should be labeled too to do it. So, label them however you want and everything. So get them all positioned the way you want them first. Then when you're happy with that, then go back and add the color, as opposed to like, doing like some people, you'll do one planet, let's say you do Jupiter, they spend a ton of time coloring it, and then only later discover, oh, it's in the wrong spot, or it doesn't fit right with especially Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn are the two big ones. Same thing when you're doing the inner planets right here, right? They're all fairly close together, and the scale of how far they are apart and how big around we're making the planets is totally different. They're totally not related at all. So because of that, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, they all kind of like mush together and overlap. So what you need to do is you need to just make a little bit higher or lower. How you do that is up to you artistically and everything. But you don't want them just all blobbed together in one big blob. You want to kind of make them so they're spaced out a little bit for it. Same thing on the sheet again. There's an asteroid belt in between Mars and Jupiter. So, for that, it's a bunch of little rocks. So you put some dots and some weird shapes in there and everything. That's the asteroid belt as far as that goes. But basically, it should look like you spent some time on it. Maybe add some solar prominences and solar flares and things like that. Add a little bit of shading with oranges and yellows and, different colors like that. Same thing, all the planets should look like the planets, right? Aside from perhaps Uranus and Neptune are the only two that are similar to each other. And even though there's a little bit of difference to them. But, think about it. If like you covered up all the other stuff and you just had one planet there, you should be able to tell which one's which. Venus doesn't look like Mars, doesn't look like Earth, doesn't look like Mercury at all, kind of thing. And Jupiter and Saturn are very different too. The sun, like I said, the sun's not flat. It has a slight curve to it. So it's not perfectly flat, and it should have, all the planets should have some detail to them. Here are some ones that past students in past years have handed in, right, for it. So you can see, like, you've got their suns, right? You've got all the planets kind of spaced out. I really like this asteroid belt right here, right? You've got the planets Jupiter and Saturn. Those are so big that they almost certainly are going to overlap, right? Each of the planets, you need to show at least half of the planet, right? So don't, you can't have like a little chunk of Saturn up here and a little tiny chunk of Jupiter up here. You have to show at least half of them. So if they overlap, kind of like this, doesn't really matter to me which one's in front. But you could kind of space them out, like, Jupiter's more up here and Saturn's down a little bit. Let's see, for these guys, same thing, it's kind of similar to that. Similar, same thing, they're kind of overlapping a little bit. One big question I always get is for Saturn, right, with its rings, or any of the planets like Uranus with its rings. You're not measuring, the rings are not part of the measurement from the sun to the planet, right? It's from planet surface to the sun surface. So the rings are kind of just there hanging out. They don't have anything to do with the spacing of it when you're doing that. When you hand this in, the actual rubric page needs to be, like I said, attached somewhere onto your paper, right? So it's got to be there because that's where your grade is going. There you go. Oh, and here you go. Here are my pictures of Jupiter and Saturn for you. Kind of showing you can have it like half off the paper. That's okay if it's kind of looking like that, just for the spacing of it and everything. And then, yeah, you want to find some nice pictures of the planets. I recommend somewhere online, it's pretty easy. You can find lots of places where they have pictures of the different planets on there. Keep in mind, like, Neptune has rings, but they're going to go kind of like up and down the rings for it. I mean, Jupiter, you can kind of see the colors. Pluto, it's going to be small, but it's kind of fun that we have pictures of it now. But it just shows you, what's going on with all these. Here's kind of like for asteroid belt. I mean, it's a whole bunch of little rocks and things like that. So hopefully this gives you some ideas of how you can do really, really well when you're, working on your map project for us. The map project is going to be due on the week of February, the second week of February. So this week you're working on it, and then next week is when it'll actually be due. But you have plenty of time to work on it that way. All right, let me know if you have any other questions. Hopefully this helps out.